title of this lecture is Surprising Things, a YouTube view of Shonagon's pillow book. Let's first look at the world of the pillow book. In the Odyssey, we got a sense of a vast world and the place of a single household within that world. In the pillow book, the reader is introduced to a very specific world. Not only introduced, but I would say translated across time into it. First, let's get some historical background about this world. Shonagon and the Heian period. Shonagon was a gentlewoman in the court of Empress Teishi in what is now Kyoto, Japan. In the pillow book, she records her impressions of this court. She probably finished writing it in the beginning of the 11th century. Okay, you know what? Scratch all of that. I'd really like much more to speak about this unconventional text in an unconventional fashion. Let me adopt Shonagon's signature style, her lists. And in addition to doing service to the text, who doesn't love a good roundup? My list will be called Surprising Things. The first item, how specific and unique and private this world that she describes is. Or should I make that number 7 if we're going to do a roundup? How specific and unique and private this world is, counting down from number 7 on the list of surprising things. Let's start by looking at Sei's time and place. Shonagon lived during the Heian period from the late 8th century to the late 12th century. Heian roughly translates as peace and tranquility and nicely captures the nature of this long period in Japanese history, which saw a great cultural flowering, in part due to contact with Chinese culture. By Sei's time, there was not much direct contact between the cultures anymore, but Chinese culture was still present in Japanese life. The city in which Shonagon lived, Kyoto, was known as the capital, and this is what she refers to it in her text. Outside of this were the provinces. For people in the capital, the provinces were considered something of a no man's land, infinitely less cultured. Culture and civilization were synonymous with court life, and the closer you could be to the emperor meant that you were closer to the essence of the capital and its culture. Shonagon was born into what would have been considered the periphery of this world. Her father was a provincial governor, which would have been a good job, but not as prestigious as the world of the court. For someone from the capital to have to go to the provinces was tantamount to cultural exile. In fact, governors often contrived to spend time in the capital, and her father, as a governor, would have had to spend time in Kyoto, the capital. We have no record of Shonagon ever having experienced provincial life, although she does refer kind of snidely to the people who live in the provinces as opposed to the capital. So within this specific time, the Heian period, and in this specific place, the capital, Kyoto, we have the emperor's court, which is at the center of the capital. The emperor at Sei's time, his name was Ichijo, and excuse my pronunciation of the Japanese words up front, I don't have training in this language. Within the capital, the palace grounds were walled, and within these walls we have living quarters, guest quarters, and administrative buildings. So within Heian culture, in the capital city, within the emperor's court, we have Shonagon, who was lady-in-waiting to Empress Fujiwara no Teshi, who only lived to be about 23 years old. She entered Teishi's court as a gentlewoman in the year 993 or so, and she would have been in her late 20s or maybe early 30s, and thus much older than the other people who were there in the court, the other gentlewomen. Her service there at court ended with Teishi's death, which happened a mere 7 years later. So Teishi died during childbirth, and there had been a bitter rivalry between her and the other empress, her husband's other wife, whose name was Empress Shoshi. Teishi's father had died, and this left her in a vulnerable position at court. There was a lot of jockeying for position, and it was considered a cultural achievement to have your daughter be there in court. Perhaps she would get to be empress and bear the next emperor. So she was in a liminal position when her father died. Her uncle elbowed his way into the picture and made his daughter Empress number 2, which was the first time in Japanese history when this circumstance had occurred. So here in this image, this is Empress Shoshi with her small baby son. I didn't have a good picture of Teishi to show you. So within this period of time in the capital city, within the emperor's palace, we have Teishi's world, that of her and her gentlewomen. They were in a world that was largely screened off from the larger world around it. The empress would have been located in the inner chamber. A wide aisle area surrounded that central room, would have seen all the comings and goings of various people. The word palace is used, but really these are rather plain wooden buildings that we're talking about here. And rooms were temporary constructions, usually made of portable screens. So within this world of Teishi and her gentlewomen, the traffic was monitored pretty carefully. So the empress's visitors from the outer world were received by the gentlewomen, who themselves were obscured by lowered blinds or standing curtains. The only men who were allowed to pass through the curtains were family members or lovers, which Sei herself, we are led to believe, had several of them, and this would have been an acceptable practice among gentlewomen at the time. If they knew they weren't being observed, the gentlewomen could sneak outside to go on the veranda or take a walk in the garden. Sei Shonagon speaks about men who work for the government, but she doesn't get into the nitty-gritty and all of the details about politics, which is so interesting because her world abuts up against the world of the central government. As far as she's concerned, her cozy world is the center of the universe and the object of her complete attention. Sei's book is preoccupied with the notion of an Akashi aesthetic. That is, it's attuned to delightful things, and then on the flip side, things that do not delight her. Some scholars have suggested that this is a purposeful rhetorical stance that Sei takes on as a literary strategy in order to have a rosy outlook on the empress's court, because Teishi's story ends up quite tragic. She dies in childbirth, and she's elbowed out of the court by the second empress. So having looked at Sei's private, cozy world, something else that I was surprised by is how complicated this text is. When you're dealing with a pre-modern text, you're often going to encounter textual variants because these texts were copied by hand very, very laboriously. Of this text, there exist 4 major variants. The version that we are using this semester is known as the Sankenban variant, which scholars agree is close to the original, although surely copyists altered the words or even entire sections in the centuries between Say's original composition and this manuscript, which dates from the early 13th century, so a couple of hundred years after she was alive. This text had a supplementary group of sections which are alluded to elsewhere but have since been lost. So, given that this is the preferred edition, you should get some sense of how fragile and incomplete it is, because of the way texts were composed 1,000 years ago, as well as how much time has passed since it was composed. Because this is poetry, we encounter several problems with translating it, or should I say several challenges are inherent to the translation of poetry. For starters, the traditional form of Japanese poetry is syllabic rather than metrical in rhythm. It has no rhyme, it uses no line division, and it depends on a lot of subtle allusions that would be lost to contemporary English speakers for sure. Translation word for word loses this poetic meaning, and despite what you might think, like a perfect translation isn't a word for word translation. So I know that I probably held that idea in my mind for many years, but capturing the original work is really what's key. Say makes such extensive use of puns that your translator editor remarked on the difficulty of conveying these in English, that a lot of them would fall flat unless she really worked them to make them hospitable to a present day English speaking audience. So why is this complicated text called the Pillow Book? As you read in the introductory materials, Teishi gifts Sei with a bundle of paper, which would have been a precious commodity at the time. Perhaps she did intend to keep it by her bed for private writing. She herself says that it is for private works that she did not intend to show to the world. But given what a good writer she is and how interested she is in poetry and literature, I can't help but wonder, is she maybe engaging in some false modesty there? She perhaps wanted to write a work that would compete with what the men were doing in the emperor's court, which was translating classics out of Chinese. The Pillow Book might also be a reference to a bed/desk kind of contraption, so I believe that it is captured here in this image. I was told that the Boston Museum of Fine Arts had a Pillow Book artifact, and I was unable to find an image of it online, but the way I've heard it described, there would be a small desk that you could have near your bed in order to jot down things, while you're waiting to fall asleep or when you very first wake up. So this desk that this lady is writing at seemed to suggest that. So what does this complicated book, the Pillow Book, include? Is it full of feathers? No, it's full of lists and personal stories. So what's so special about these lists? Well, scholars have wondered whether the lists were the original backbone of the book itself, because they are so frequent and pervasive throughout the work. So were they the original structuring device? Was the book originally meant to be a compendium of various poetic images, perhaps for herself or perhaps for other people to use? Not quite like a thesaurus, but if you were describing something in literary terms and you needed an image for something that made you happy or something that was unpleasant to smell, there you have Sei Shonagon and her many lists. What follows is an incomplete list of Sei's lists that you will encounter in the assigned reading. We've got names of mountains, names of markets, names of river pools, stars, clouds, occasions that induce half-heartedness, things people despise, infuriating things, things that make you feel cheerful, things that make you feel cheerful. I listed that one twice. Things that make your heart beat fast, things that create a disturbance, slovenly looking things, things that no one notices, like the fact that I listed cheerful twice, except that I pointed it out. And last but not least, things that fall. In addition to her lists, Say includes personal anecdotes and has lengthy descriptions of certain moments or circumstances. So two of my favorites that are in the reading that was assigned is about the dog that allegedly came back to life and her thoughts on why priests need to be handsome. My list of surprising things, we're now at number 5, the importance of literature in her world. Teishi's court was something of a literary salon. Say implies that poetic language was woven into ordinary conversations and that composing literature was part of their daily lives. For example, we see Teishi coaching the gentlewomen into writing a poem. Come on, she scolded. Don't waste time racking your brains. Just quickly jot down any ancient poem that comes to you on the spur of the moment. Then once she sees Say's poem, here we get the reaction shot. Her Majesty ran her eye over the poems, remarking, I just wanted to discover what was in your hearts. So to be part of this elite world, you had to have some knowledge of literature as an important aspect of culture. So you had to know the poetic canon, the great literary works, to be able to allude to it and perhaps even be able to write your own poems. So we see a few times in her text where messages are exchanged by hand, and these are poems composed by the sender, and we're led to believe written in beautiful calligraphy, and they're almost like a personally made greeting card. Although such exchanges of poetry were common throughout the court, they seem to come up most often in Say's account in the context of romantic relationships. So a love interest may decide, for or against pursuing a relationship based on somebody's poetic chops, as it were. So that's just a little plug for the English major, because even today, your romantic interests are surely most invested and keenest about your way with words and your knowledge of the literary canon. So major in English. That's Bondurant Hall. What would Say's inspirations for the Pillow Book have been, or I should more accurately say, what would have been her wider literary context? So at the Emperor's court, the men were translating Chinese classics. A woman would have been banned from this endeavor. So Chinese is a literary language. Japanese poetry, even when men composed it, was written in the vernacular language. So I know that this is a strange concept for us to wrap our brains around, but in cultural periods prior to ours, there would often be a language reserved for writing and one reserved for spoken conversation. So the readiest example that comes to my mind is Latin in the medieval West was a literary and documentary language, while your vernaculars, including English, were what the 98% spoke. So this language and script, the Japanese language and script, were associated with women's reading and writing. This would have included romantic tales that were written for women by men. Again, to draw an analog to the medieval West, the genre of the romance functioned in the same way. So it was called the Romance because it was written in a Romance language as opposed to Latin. So it was in the vernacular, if you were French. Less literate people who couldn't read Latin indulge in them. So that would have included elite women who would have had the luxury time to read. Say's style is really quite different. I mean, she's like the realistic antithesis to this romantic genre. So, although she romanticizes Teishi's court and paints it in very rosy terms, um, she's got a very deadpan, droll, even catty quality to her writing in her descriptions and observations. Surprising thing number 4, she's a clothes horse. Just like me when I'm not in isolation. You'll notice as you read the text that Say doesn't pay much attention to people's faces or bodies, but she spends a lot of energy describing their clothing. Facial features, body types, all of these things that I believe any of us would include when describing a person, these are barely mentioned. The person is the clothes that they wear. So in this scene, we have the women who are in the Empress's court, and the Emperor and a governmental counselor are conversing outside on the veranda. Inside the blinds, we gentlewomen sat with our cherry blossom combination Chinese jackets worn draped loosely back from the shoulders. Our robes were a fine blend of wisteria and caria yellow and other seasonal combinations, the sleeves all spilling out on the display below the blinds that hung from the little half-panel shutters. So the clothes really take up the central matter of this description. Let's have a look at how she describes her romantic relationships with men, because this is somewhere where we'd expect her to give some physical description of the person or even the romantic interlude. This was something that she says is an irritating thing or such. She says, a man you've had to conceal in some unsatisfactory hiding place who then begins to snore. Or a man comes on a secret visit wearing a particularly tall lacquered cap, and of course, as he scuttles in hastily, he manages to knock it against something with a loud bump. So Say is descriptive, but she does not get into physical details. We can see this tendency in the following passage, which was not part of your assigned reading, but I just really liked it. In the 7th month, when the wind blows hard and the rain is beating down, and your fan lies forgotten because of the sudden coolness in the air, it's delightful to take a midday nap snuggled up under a lightly padded kimono that gives off a faint whiff of perspiration. So the passage there is not so much physical as sensual. As with her clothes, her experience of the event and how it piqued her senses is what she's attuned to, rather than an objective physical description. So consider this. In our culture, the sense of sight is often privileged. But if you think of it, of the 5 senses, when you're seeing something, you have to be physically removed from it. So all of us wouldn't describe a visual phenomenon in exactly the same way, but we all do have that bit of distance that implies some kind of objectivity. But the senses of smelling and tasting and touching all engage the body in a very direct way. And even hearing, the sound has to strike the inside of your ear physically for you to be able to hear it. So she's very, very, very engaged with her world in a sensuous way. Surprising things. Number 3, how modern the text feels. Say's text has been compared to any number of social media, Tumblr, a blog, a Twitter account. And indeed, her text is a mixture of the poetic with the mundane, the beautiful with the ridiculous, and thus it seems random and unedited, as if written extemporaneously, like social media posts are. So let's consider this issue, its immediacy and extemporaneous quality, and even its unedited quality, a little bit more carefully. Let's pretend that Say has a Twitter account and she's going off about infuriating things in the middle of the night while everyone else is asleep. I hate it when, either at home or at the palace, someone comes calling whom you'd rather not see, and you pretend to be asleep, but then a well-meaning member of the household comes along and shakes you awake with a look of disapproval at how you've dozed off. Some newcomer steps in and starts interfering and lecturing the old hands, as if she knows it all. This is quite infuriating. A man you're in a relationship with speaks admiringly of some woman who was once his lover. This rankles, even if the affair is now safely in the past, and you can imagine how much more enraging it would be if she were actually a current lover of his. Still, there are also some situations in which it doesn't really bother you. If the fragmented nature of the pillow book is one of its defining features, let's think about how it would read if it weren't fragmented into sections. Early manuscripts of the pillow book suggest that Say's text was a continuous one. There were no section divisions. So what if we got rid of these divisions? As you read the text, see if you can see themes that extend beyond these divisions. Number 2 on my list of surprising things, how present the author feels. The pillow book is written in a language that epitomized the beauty of Heian culture. Another major work, The Tale of Genji, is regarded as the very first novel, also written by a female author, and I'll get to her in a second. However, when Shonagon was writing, this language had none of this aura. It was written in a language that was not very different from everyday spoken Japanese. And remember, I mentioned that in pre-modern cultures, there's often an idea that the language of writing and literature has to be more elevated than the language of everyday discourse. So according to the cultural norms of the time, this would have made her work less literary. However, her use of vernacular speech is something that I think makes her voice sound more vivid. In her work, she speaks about a certain poetic convention, quoting from Chinese poetry. However, it was considered unseemly for a woman to betray any knowledge of it. Meredith McKinney, who is the translator and editor of the text that we're using, writes, "The Chinese language belonged to the sphere of men. Their public and official writing, of both prose and poetry, was conducted in Chinese, and their education was largely devoted to the Chinese classics." So an intelligent woman could gain surreptitious knowledge of these classics, and in the pillow book she describes men reciting Chinese poetry in front of the women, but it was frowned upon for women to flaunt this knowledge. So what would have been acceptable forms of women's writing at the time? Well, romantic tales, which she was surely familiar with, she had probably read them and heard them read to her. The other possibility for women's writing was the diary. So this is a genre that men also engaged in, but it was really much more like keeping accounts, like something we'd write down in our iCalendars or checkbooks. McKinney, your editor, writes, "Women took the diary form and made it a looser, more subjective, and psychologically penetrating record of lived experience." Unlike the tales, these diaries were not meant to be popular entertainment, but they were an acceptable form of literary activity for women. And I should say that a lot of the other diaries are kind of somber compared to Say's, which is quite hilarious at times, I must say. And introspection, this capacity for inward looking, is recognized as a feature of women's writing, like at least in my experience. So the feature of immediacy is something that I feel is central to Say Shonagon's pillow book. Sometimes it reads as just a list of her pleasures and irritations, but that's what makes it so immediate. And that's why I know as a reader, I was able to step into her world and listen to her as if she was talking directly to me. The lists and descriptions aren't meant to build some larger narrative or plot, but rather she is capturing a moment. And that's what I know really drew me into the text. I would even say that Say's language has a timeless, time-bending quality to it. So we know that it doesn't translate perfectly into English. So among the challenges in translating it include the fact that she doesn't often specify a verb tense or a particular person, i.e. a pronoun. So she'll even just say you. She doesn't give a lot of context, and she moves freely, even in a disjointed kind of fashion, between different experiences. But I know that I found that made me feel as if I was in a timeless kind of frame of mind. And then added to that, a lot of her complaints were so relatable because people behave in the same way today and notice and complain about many of these same things today. So be honest. How many of you found yourself agreeing with one of her poignant observations? Number one, most surprising thing about the Pillow Book? How can anyone not like her? So I really enjoy this book, and this is why I assigned it for y'all to read to this semester, and it's especially timely given that she's describing a very private world while we are all living in social isolation. But other critics don't agree with me. Her work, compared with other Heian women's writing from the period, is regarded as frivolous, shallow, and erratic. The Tale of Genji is often looked at the crowning literary masterpiece of the period, and it could not be more different from Say's work because it is a romance, a tale of fantasy, and Say is sometimes I feel like she's just telling it like it is. Other diarists were more somber and more serious. So we get a very pointed assessment of Say's work from Murasaki Shikibu, who is the author of The Tale of Genji. She was a gentlewoman in the court of the empress who had supplanted Teishi, so that was Say's empress, and she offers this analysis of Say's work in her diary. Say Shonagon was dreadfully conceited. She thought herself so clever and littered her writings with Chinese characters. But if you examined them closely, they left a great deal to be desired. Those who think themselves as being superior to everyone else in this way will inevitably suffer and come to a bad end, and people who have become so precious that they go out of their way to try and be sensitive in the most unpromising situations, trying to capture every moment of interest, however slight, are bound to look ridiculous and superficial. How can the future turn out well for them? By other critics, Say has been dismissed as a chatterbox of a woman, and the Pillow Book judged as nothing more than a silly gentlewoman's idle thoughts spilling themselves haphazardly onto the page. Yet the Pillow Book is regarded as a literary classic. It is widely taught, it is widely anthologized, it is frequently alluded to and quoted from in other literary works. So why are we studying it? Well, in social isolation, perhaps we would all do well to observe all of the surprising things in our private worlds.